This happened one evening when I was 13 years old, which was in the mid-1990s. I was home alone watching TV, and there was a knock at the door. It was already dark outside, and I couldn't see who it was through the small peephole in the door. But since the lights and TV were on, I knew the person on the other side knew I was there. My parents always taught me to be cautious when it came to strangers. They were especially strict about not letting anyone into the house when they weren't home, so I was apprehensive. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see that it was a man in his late 20s or early 30s. He seemed polite enough, and he explained that his car had broken down, and he needed to use the phone to call for help. I was hesitant to let him in. My parents had always warned me about situations like this, but I also didn't want to turn him away if he really needed help. I asked him where his car was, and he pointed down the road, but when I looked outside, I didn't see any car in sight. I also couldn't help but wonder why he walked past the two houses right next to mine, which had visible cars in their driveways. I thought he chose our house because it looked like nobody was home. When I told him that, the man became agitated and defensive, which only made me more scared of him. We argued for a while. He insisted that he really needed to use the phone, but I told him to check with one of my neighbors. Finally, I decided it was best for me to just tell him to leave. As I shut the door and locked it behind me, the man started yelling and cursing at me. He called me all kinds of names. Remember, I was only 13 at the time. I stood my ground and refused to let him in. A pretty obvious choice at that point. I could hear him walking away, still shouting obscenities, and I felt relieved that the encounter was over. I walked around the house and made sure all the doors were locked, even though I was pretty sure they were already. After a minute or two, I decided to call my parents and tell them what happened. They were both concerned, and they told me to stay inside and make sure all the doors were locked, to which I told them that I already did. I did as they instructed, and spent the next half hour sitting nervously on the couch, waiting for them to come home. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night. My parents came home as soon as they could, and I was really happy not to be alone anymore. The next day, my parents talked to several of our closest neighbors. None of them had a visit from that guy. My dad was pretty sure that it was somebody scouting out the neighborhood for robberies. I noticed that all my neighbors had cars in their driveway at that time, so that would explain why he chose us. We also started to notice a strange car circling the neighborhood. I never got a good look at it, so I couldn't tell if it was the same guy, but it would make sense if they were connected. In the end, my parents reported the incident to the police, but nothing came of it. We never saw that man again, and life went back to normal. But a few weeks later, one of my neighbors, an elderly couple, were robbed. It's impossible to know for sure, but I think the incidents were connected. My name's Colin, and I was 15 years old when this happened. It was the year 2001, so you can figure out my current age if you want to. It was a typical summer day, and I had gotten home from school. I was in the basement playing StarCraft, my favorite computer game at the time. I still play it sometimes, actually. I'd been playing for about half an hour, and I was completely immersed in the game. Suddenly I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, and I assumed it was my mother coming home from work. I heard footsteps on the porch, which was right above where I was in the basement. And I heard the sound of the screen door opening, but not the main door. I wondered what was going on, so I decided to go upstairs and check. As I walked up the stairs, I heard the sound of voices coming from the backyard. I peeked through the curtains and saw two guys standing there, looking at the windows and talking in hushed tones. At first I assumed they were friends of my older brother, but then I realized that they were strangers. These guys were too old to be friends with me or my brother. They were at least 25. One of them was overweight with a gray sweatshirt, and the other one was around average size with a black t-shirt. Both had short beards. Then I saw one of them walk by the other window. I knew that something was seriously wrong. I kept trying to think of a reasonable explanation, but there wasn't any. My parents would never hire a repairman or anything like that while I was home alone. I had to do something before they broke into the house. I went to the back door and looked out the window through the curtains. I saw the two guys standing outside, looking around nervously. One of them tried to open the door, but it was locked. He jiggled the handle twice, then I heard a loud pound on the door, as if he hit it out of frustration that it was locked. I didn't think they knew I was there, and I tried to stay quiet so they wouldn't know. I called my mom at work, and I told her what was happening. She immediately called the police and told me to stay inside. I went to my bedroom and tried to keep myself calm, but I was terrified. I could hear the guys outside trying to open the doors and windows. I decided to hide. I went into my closet and tried to stay as quiet as I could. I could hear the guys moving around outside. I was worried that they would break a window and come into the house, but that didn't happen. I guess they were worried about the noise. They wanted to find an unlocked door or window. After another 5 long minutes, I heard the sound of sirens. The police were close. I heard them yelling at the guys to get to the ground and to put their hands up. I came out of my closet and looked out my bedroom window. I couldn't see anything, so I went to my brother's room, and I saw the two guys being handcuffed and put into the police car. It was finally over. One of the officers waited with me until my mom got home, which was only another few minutes. Overall, this was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me in my childhood. I think every kid has nightmares about a break-in while they're home alone. I was lucky that these guys checked all the doors first. It gave me a chance to call the police. I've read stories where the robbers smashed a window or picked a lock right away. Luckily, I was able to get help before it was too late. I grew up in a small farmhouse that was nestled in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by sprawling corn and wheat fields. It was the kind of place where the only sound was the rustling of leaves or the occasional chirping of crickets. One night my parents had gone out of town, leaving me alone in the house. I spent the night by myself. My parents gave me some chores to do, but it wasn't much. I spent most of the night playing video games and chatting with my friends. At around 11:30, I stepped out onto the porch for a cigarette. I sat on the porch swing, enjoying the cool night air and the stars overhead. About halfway through my cigarette, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head and saw someone standing on the road in front of my house. At first I thought it might be one of my friends or a neighbor, but as I looked closer, I realized that I didn't know the person. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with broad shoulders. He wore dark clothes, but I couldn't really tell much else. It was too dark to make out any details of his face, but something about the way he stood sent chills down my spine. Maybe it was just the circumstances that made it seem that way, though. The man stood there, completely still, as if waiting for something. There were no neighbors for miles, and I knew for sure it wasn't anyone I recognized. There was no car parked on the road either, which made me wonder how he got there. It was really confusing. I was super creeped out, so I got up and went back into the house. I went upstairs and brushed my teeth. When I was done, I looked out the window. That person was still there. He was pacing back and forth on the road. His steps were quick and forceful. It was like he was late for something. He was just walking back and forth. I didn't think he was doing anything illegal, just being creepy, so I didn't call the police. I decided to take a shower and then check back after. The man was still there, but now he was standing still again, looking at my house. I was beyond creeped out at that point. I couldn't go to bed with him out there. Who knows what he would do if I fell asleep. I called my parents, who were visiting family over 5 hours away. When my dad answered, I told him what was happening. He thought it was a joke at first, but after a few minutes, I convinced him I was serious. He told me to call the police immediately. I hung up the phone and called the police, like he said. I told them that I needed help. The officer told me that somebody would be there soon. I sat there on my bed for a few long minutes. I looked out the window every few seconds, and the man had started pacing again. It took a little over half an hour for the police to arrive. My house was in a really remote area. The wait was agonizing, but I looked out the window and saw the police car, and I was really relieved. I went out to talk to the officers, but when I opened the door, I noticed the man was gone. When I talked to the police, I found out that they didn't see him at all. I was really confused by that. The only place he could have gone was into the wheat field across the street from my house. I couldn't sleep for that entire night. I kept thinking that the man would appear at the end of my bed, just standing there staring at me. That didn't happen though, and I haven't seen him again yet. There's no way I can explain what he was doing, or even how he got there without a car. It was seriously terrifying, and I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened that night. When I was 17, I had 3 dogs. Vatani, a Dutch Shepherd Pit Bull mix, Sarah, a Yellow Lab Whippet mix, and Kodiak, a Lab Dalmatian Greyhound mix. Vatani was 6, Sarah was 2, and Kodiak was 1, respectively at the time. Even though Kodiak was young, he had a deep bark and growled at any man or boy who came up to me besides my brother. Sarah was a calm dog who hardly barked or growled unless she had to. And Vatani hated all strangers because her original owners mistreated her. I was home alone one night. My mom and brother were on their way back from another city when it started raining hard. They decided to stay in a hotel so they wouldn't have to drive in the rain. Of course, I made sure the doors and windows were locked. At around 8 p.m., I noticed Sarah was growling. My heart dropped because, like I said, Sarah hardly ever barked or growled. I then heard a knock at the front door. I answered it, and it was the bishop from my church. I got really scared because my bishop was obsessed with me. I tried to play it cool and asked him, "Bishop, why are you here? It's raining." Then all of a sudden, he grabbed me. I yelled Vatani. All 3 dogs tackled him to the ground. I called the cops and my mom. She and my brother raced home. By the time the cops got there, my dogs had messed him up really bad. He was arrested, and my dogs were hailed as heroes. I don't have my dogs anymore, but I miss them a lot. It was a Friday night, and my parents had left for the weekend. I had the house to myself, which was something I was looking forward to for a long time. I planned to order takeout, binge watch my favorite TV show, and maybe invite some friends over. As I settled into the couch with my food, I heard a knock at the front door. I was taken aback, since I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached the door cautiously, peeking through the peephole. I didn't recognize the person who was standing outside. He was a tall, thin man in his late 20s. He wore a blue plaid collared shirt and had a stack of papers in his right hand. He looked harmless enough, but given the circumstances, I was a little worried. I opened the door anyway. I don't actually know why. Maybe it was just curiosity, or just habit. He was very polite and well-spoken, and then gave me some kind of a sales pitch about something that I can't really remember. Something about our gas bill. I don't know. I didn't know why he bothered, because I was only 14 at the time. I obviously didn't make decisions like that. I closed the door and then went back to the living room. The rest of the night passed without incident. I watched TV, checked my social media, and eventually went to bed. But just as I was dozing off, I heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like somebody was in our backyard. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I thought someone was there. I was going to call the police, but before I could, I heard a smash from downstairs. It could only have been a broken window. I knew that somebody was inside the house. I locked myself in the bathroom. The lock was pretty weak, and I knew it wouldn't have taken much to kick it down. I felt really vulnerable. I could hear the sound of footsteps downstairs. As I sat there in the bathroom, I realized that I left my phone on the nightstand in my bedroom. I had no way of calling for help, or even checking the time. Minutes passed that felt like hours, and I could hear the intruder moving through the house. I considered going out to grab my phone, but I was way too scared. I tried to make as little noise as possible, hoping that he wouldn't find me, but his footsteps were getting closer. He was on the upper floor now. There was a small window in the bathroom. I walked over and opened it. I had to stand on the towel rack to get up to it, but I managed to escape. I stepped out onto the roof and quietly closed the window. I sat there on the roof for a few minutes trying to decide how to get down. My mom had a large flower pot that was right underneath where I was standing. It was half a wooden barrel. It was at least 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall. I jumped from the roof onto it, and it was enough to break my landing. I made it down without hurting myself. Once I was down, I started running away from the house. One of my neighbors is a good friend, so I ran there. When I reached my neighbor's house, I pounded on the door, screaming for help. The lights flicked on, and the door opened to reveal my friend's mom. "What's going on? Are you okay?" she asked, looking at me with concern. I tried to speak, but I was grasping for breath. I could feel the tears streaming down my face as I struggled to regain my composure. I finally managed to tell her what happened. "It's okay," she said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Come inside, and we'll call the police." She led me into the living room and handed me a glass of water. I sat there trembling as she called the police and told them what happened. They arrived a few minutes later. They searched my house, but the intruder was gone. They assured me that they would keep a close eye on the area, and that I should call them if I saw anything suspicious. I told them about the guy who came to my door earlier that day. They said that it may have been somebody scouting ahead to find a good target. He must have known that my parents were away. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed with my friend, unable to go back to my own house. My parents returned home the next day, and I told them the full story. They were understandably upset, but also relieved that I was okay. There was some stuff missing from the house, but it was minor compared to the experience that I had. It's been a few months since that night, and it still really scares me from time to time. We've installed security cameras and an alarm system, but I still feel scared whenever I'm alone in the house.